Well, thank you very much, Kirby, and Rongching, and Gahi, and all of you for coming back. I noticed that many of the people in the room were here earlier today, and I was thinking this is a little bit like you've set things up here a little bit like the usual genre of jazz sessions. So there's one early set where the speakers or the musician are kind of dry and staid, and then I thought I'd make a little more. This is a little more lighthearted one for those of you who come back, and it's quite a different topic, and so I hope you have. I hope I have more fun than I did this morning, and that I'm a little looser and more entertaining at this point, and I'll have a drink at that juncture too.
That's not his slide, but he created it.
Yes.
There we go.
And yes, so I'm going to talk about. I should maybe give you a bit of a context as to why I focused on this topic. And there's where I met Luciana actually there's an annual symposium on second language writing, and last year they had invited people from different countries to talk about the history of second language writing in their respective countries. So I'm rehashing that talk, but the people in the audience seem to have had fun, so I hope you do too, and so on. So the context is I'm going to, I guess, be the cross-cultural ambassador. I came yesterday afternoon across the border and into the United States, and we'll talk a little bit about Canada. And I think you might find if you do research or teach second language writing, you might find that there are a lot of interconnections really across the borders. One thing that I usually say to Americans is that when you watch TV and movies, a lot of the people that you think are Americans that are really funny and intelligent and so on are really Canadians. You might recognize Martin Short, Andrea Martin. These are all the Second City television people. John Candy, who's no longer with us, I guess. Catherine O'Hara. When I was a PhD student, my wife and I stayed in the upper part of what used to be the Romanian embassy, what was split up into apartments. And Catherine O'Hara had the big, grand apartment on the ground floor too. So there's a little bit of a connection there. Maybe she's not as famous as the other people. And then I said I gave this talk in China. How many people are from China here? Well, yeah, I'm waiting for a chuckle. So you recognize Dashin, who's apparently, is this true? He's the funniest guy in China, a comedian, or one of the funniest ones in but he's really a guy named Mark Roswell, who's from Canada and learned to speak and all the local jargon in Beijing and so on. So that spreads things internationally. But then, my joke in this whole scenario that I'm going through has been disrupted completely in the last few months by one character that you're probably thinking of. And so there's this one huge glaring example that you know as Canadian, and that I can only be embarrassed about. And I honestly, when we were in Cuba at Christmas for a vacation, I don't know how many Americans asked my wife and I whether we voted for Rob Ford. No, everybody in the suburbs voted for Rob Ford. Everybody in the city did not vote for Rob Ford. And he continues. And I was going to put Justin Bieber up there, but I thought that would be overkill. So. Anyway, that's the one huge exception. And then maybe he is a comedian too, and I think that may be the only thing he does, but I don't really appreciate the humor very much. But the reason I put things that way is because this field of second language writing seems to be disproportionately represented by people who are Canadian in it. There are a lot of the studies and the groundwork for educational practices and understanding related to writing in second languages comes out of Canada, and disproportionately so. The population of Canada is about 35 million or so, and maybe that's about the same as New York State and Pennsylvania together. When I presented this in China, I was saying this is like a small fraction of just Beijing or some city, but like that. But they're influential. And there might only be 100 people in Canada that actually do research on second language writing. If they were all assembled together, they might look a little bit smaller than this group that was celebrating Canada Day, or equivalent of July 4th in, I don't know, Ottawa, I guess that is. And most of us are, like me, prefer to sit at home and work on the computer, and they're not usually very funny, in fact, comedians, but I'm trying to be now, if you haven't noticed. And rather than standing up at a podium, and I see I'm actually wearing the same shirt and jacket on this. As I looked over my slides this morning, I realized, and I actually tried on 2 different shirts this morning, and I thought this one, because it's got a permanent press thing, wasn't as crumpled looking as the other one that was maybe nicer colors, But the reason, I think the fundamental reason why there's so much research on second language literacy or writing in Canada is that for 3 historical reasons related to the nature of the country, really. Canada's always been a country of immigrant settlement, somewhat like the United States. There were Aboriginal peoples, First Nations peoples, they tend to be called. But Canada is essentially populated by all of the English speakers who did not participate in the American Revolution. So the English speakers all went across the border with the British and settled up there in Ontario and the eastern provinces. And the French, who might have been resettled out of Louisiana or were settled in Quebec and other parts of Canada. And so Canada's always had this policy of official bilingualism, English-French. People expect tout le monde au Canada pour parler français, and I can, but I grew up in Vancouver and had to make a conscientious effort as an adult. J'ai développé un accent de Montréal, and j'ai aussi un accent de France. So I'm bidialectal. Most Canadians only speak one of those 2 languages unless they live in Montreal or Ottawa or Moncton. There's only 3 cities really where people functionally are bilingual English-French, and then a few people from one area or another. But the official policies of the country are to be English-French bilingual, and all government services are offered in both languages, although it's hard to find them if you're not in the right area, but they're supposed to be there. And the cities in Canada are all, like New York City is, culturally diverse, made up of people from many parts of the world and have been for a long time, much like the United States. And most of the research is around this topic is around the major cities. I live in Toronto. I grew up in Vancouver. Calgary has quite a culturally diverse population, and Montreal and Ottawa do too. And there are a few other cities that could be added onto that map as well. But this is just all I could find on the internet that had a good map and the names of the cities on it. And most of the major universities are located in these major cities, and I just took these figures off of an internet site that the major cities are in the major universities, and the populations by full-time student population do tend to be in those major cities as well. Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton too, and Montreal. And so the programs in faculties like Teachers College and the equivalent either English departments or linguistics departments or education programs tend to focus on these issues of immigrant settlement, English-French bilingualism, or the cultural diversity in the cities. And what I'm going to talk about is, in the talk overall, the 3 generations that I see of this research. The whole area of studies of second language writing really came out of the foundations of the sort of burgeoning of research on writing. Much of it centered in the United States, England, a little bit in Australia and New Zealand as well, in the 1980s on English as a mother tongue. And that followed from what had earlier been research about reading literacy from the 60s and 70s. People realized in the 1980s that yeah, reading is important, but writing is the other dimension of literacy and the abilities that people need to learn to be successful in education and at work and so on. And so this fields of educational psychology, what was then growing as applied linguistics, and the field of rhetoric, which was then growing. In Canada, people followed this trend that was taking place in Europe, Australasia, and the US and Canada as well. And people decided it was time to look at writing distinct from reading and to try to research it empirically and to theorize, develop models of what people did when they wrote and how they developed it, and a lot of the studies of the processes of writing and the nature of discourse, written discourse, appeared at that time. So there was a foundational generation that I call, and these were the professors that I studied my PhD with, Carl Breiter and Marlene Scardamalia, and their results were synthesized in their 1987 books, and they were very much cognitive psychologists. Since after that time, almost all of their research has been about computer-mediated education and reoriented and shifted it. And Carl's retired for a while, but Marlene's about my age, and she's still going. But that's I think a major study and a very influential one for me. Maybe less well known are a couple of professors, again a couple at McGill University, Carl Fredrickson and Janet Donnan, and then I've cited one of their publications. They didn't publish as much as, they did a lot of research projects, and they were very similarly aligned to Breiter and Scarnamelia's research, but I don't think they published as much. They were not influential as widely or broadly for that reason. And similarly, they've reoriented their research to focus more on computer-mediated processing, and they were more discourse analysts as well as cognitive psychologists in their orientation. So they have a very elaborate framework for analyzing both spoken and written discourse that's well worth pursuing. In Ottawa, there was another couple. They were not, the other ones were married or lived together. These two, Aviva Freeman and Ian Pringle, just worked together. They were married, but not to each other. So Aviva, they both have husbands. And I made a sort of principle that I would only get pictures from the internet that were publicly available on this, and I couldn't find one of Ian Pringle. Does anybody ever met him? But he looks a lot like this. This is what comes up, and that is he's kind of round-headed and balding ever since I've met him, and so on. So it's not too far off. That's a very good picture of Aviva Freeman. And they were very much rhetoricians, so this book, Reinventing the Rhetorical Tradition, and they, although they worked in an applied linguistics, Center for Applied Linguistics was the unit, and I worked for a while at Carleton University with them. They interfaced with educators as well, too, and Aviva Freeman developed a lot of the Canadian versions of genre theory, actually, and her research is especially prolific about that. And Ian Pringle, in fact, was a sociolinguist whose major work was with the dialect of the Ottawa Valley, if anybody's a sociolinguist in this area, and he might be well known for that. And similarly, Bernie Moen looks a little bit like Ian Pringle does too, although I was able to get a picture of him. He's balding and round-headed and so on. But Bernie's now retired, but Margaret Early's still very active at the University of British Columbia, and Bernie is more of an applied linguist and a systemic functional linguist in their orientations. And so they came out with a different disciplinary background in Vancouver. And those people, I would call them, sorry, I should go back and say, Bernie and Margaret worked together, but they were not. They're married to other people as well too, so they're not a couple. But it is interesting that there's so many of these people tend to be male-female couples, and the winters are long and cold in Canada, and maybe that's what brings people together. I put them forward as a kind of grandparents for me. That's an older generation that supervised many PhD theses, including my own, mentored many people into this field, and I think have been extremely influential. And going back, Bernie's originally Irish. Ian's originally from New Zealand. Fredrickson and Donnan are both American originally. Carl Breiter was originally from the U.S., and so there's actually quite a cross-fertilization. When I did my master's degree in late 1970s, there were no Canadian professors in English literature, in linguistics, and so on, for a very simple reason. There were no PhD programs at universities in Canada until the 1970s when they were established. So many of the people that came to be professors at the universities in all fields were really from somewhere else. They tended to be from the United States or England or perhaps Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. Anyway, there were some people that weren't. actually some of them, like Gordon Wells, were couples with many different people, if you know him. But they weren't, they have a notorious reputations. I shouldn't say that in public and being videotaped, but anyway, he's at the University of Santa Cruz in California now, too. Hi, Gordon, if you're listening. And he might appreciate the reputation. Anyway, there were individuals that worked much more. David Olson on linguistic theory, Gordon Wells on sociocultural theory and literacy, Susan Heady on summary tasks, integrated tasks I was talking about with some people earlier today. At McGill University, Anthony Paré, Patrick Diaz, Mary McGuire, and Bob Bracewell all did quite separate, actually, Paré and Diaz, studies of professional writing, Mary McGuire in school settings, and Bob Bracewell was a student of Carl Breiter and David Olson's and followed that cognitive psychology approach. Stan Jones at Carleton University, who Jim might know from he did things on the TOEFL and assessment in that area, and Joe Belanger and Marion Crowhurst at the University of British Columbia were other people that were influential and published extensively on that on first language writing, and had a similarly supervised PhD theses and taught courses and did research that influenced the people that got into second language writing. But with the exception of Bernie and Margaret, almost all of these people that I've mentioned up to now really focused on English as a dominant language or as a mother tongue. It was in the 1980s that people like me doing the PhD in the 1990s that the area focus on second language writing really came to the foreground. And many of the people that did the research were students of the people I've mentioned before, or colleagues. Their colleagues. I'd worked with many of those people. Many of them, like myself, were experienced teachers of English and recognized that the school population, the university populations involves international students, recent immigrants, and some of the things that people were doing on studying English as a mother tongue or a dominant language needed to be explored and understood better for second language writing. And so many of us established programs of research related to second language writing, and we tended to integrate the focus on learning, composing, teaching, assessment, and curricula, or to specialize in some of those areas. And we ended up in following the distribution of populations and programs at the same sorts of cities that I'd mentioned for the previous generation, too. The notable publications in the 1980s were often derivatives of taking the approach to research or the methods of inquiry or the analytic units or the orientations that were established in first language writing and then applying them to second language contexts. And I'm as guilty or as notable for doing that as anybody, I suppose. But we were really trying to, each of us, I think, independently, trying to understand what was unique about writing in a second language that's different from the first language. And often the relationship between the two. I guess Jim Cummins, I didn't list his name up there, but his research and his idea of the interdependence of cross-linguistic interdependence of academic or literacy skills across first and second languages was really a kind of a guiding principle, and it still is for many people. 2 weeks from now, we're having a celebration of Jim Cummins' accomplishments in Toronto as he retires this summer, so moves on. Some of the notable publications in the 1980s, just to give you a sampling of, I think some of them were, one of the first studies was Stan Jones and Jackie Tetro, who was a student and research officer with Carl Breiter and Marlene Scardamalia, I think published one of the first articles about the processes of composing in second languages and used the process tracing methods that Breiter and Scardamalia had made famous. And I have a little link in there because the students they studied, I was teaching, so they were all Venezuelans who were studying in preparation for university degrees in Toronto. But they were one of the first process tracing studies of second language writing. And then my PhD thesis was similarly looking at these issues and trying to establish what the differences or similarities primarily were between people who were very skilled writers and not so skilled writers and not very good writers in the first language, French, and how those abilities transferred across to their writing in English as a second language in adult populations. Bernie Moen, somebody at the break after the talk this morning was asking me about contrastive rhetoric. Bernie Moen and Winnie Lowe, this would have been her PhD actually I think it was a master's thesis, it was a thesis anyway, really challenged what was then the prominent idea about writing in second languages, Robert Kaplan's notion of contrastive rhetoric, and argued that the factors that he was saying were responsible for the rhetorical organization of the discourse in Chinese, where they tried, I think, convincingly demonstrated, related to the educational background and expectations of the students who were Chinese, writing in English in schools in Vancouver, and or the opportunities that they had to read and write and so on, and that really the so-called squiggles diagrams were really quite narrowly conceived and didn't take into account the variability in the educational experiences and the familiarity or socialization into literacy practices that should have been accounted for. In the 1990s, I think there was a big shift in this whole field, not just in Canada, but it's very noticeable in Canada as I look back. It's universal that people stopped doing the studies like these previous ones that were either experiments, where people asked students to come in and write experimental tasks or were for the purposes of control, and shifted over to naturalistic contexts, to studies in classrooms, of individuals in their lives, in workplaces, and the guiding paradigm has become one of naturalistic observation. I think that's true in applied linguistics generally, but I think it's much more pronounced in studies of second language writing, where you'd rarely see anybody setting up a set of tasks for students to do that are not natural ones, because what people do in an experimental type context for writing is maybe akin to writing a formal standardized test, but it isn't really like the conditions that one writes for academic purposes or work purposes and so on. And there have been a predominance of longitudinal studies. People, instead of just doing a couple of tasks and comparing the task, people have traced how people develop their writing abilities over time. And within recognize the particular context that they're writing in, be they university courses or workplace situations or community settlement contexts, or major determinants of the kinds of writing that are expected and the opportunities that people have to write, and their desires or their aims for improving their writing. And so we got a next generation of scholars who completed their PhD studies on second language writing. Not necessarily, the program might not be called second language writing or TESOL or what have you. It might be called English or psychology or curriculum and so on. But the publications proliferated. Tony Silva has these charts that he always puts forward of just the boom in the 90s of the number of frequency of publications in a variety of journals, and he always attributes it to the journal that he founded, the Journal of Second Language Writing, and that's a major factor for sure, and many people have contributed to that, but it's across the whole field of scholarly and professional publications as well. And just to give a few samples of, and most of these are PhD theses as well completed. Pat Curry was one of the early studies to follow students it was at Carleton University too, as they developed their writing abilities and writing course papers over the period of the year. And rather than the sort of focus on is the paper plagiarized that still predominates a lot of things, it was looking at how the strategies the students were, this one student was using to try to deal with unfamiliar texts, enter a new disciplinary community, become familiar with the norms and so on. This is a longitudinal naturalistic perspective that comes out, unlike the focus on plagiarism or copying or cheating or so on that comes out of the exam sort of context. My early studies, I just cite one of them that was trying to illuminate the background variables that contribute to the success or lack of success among students who had recently immigrated to Canada, and trying to point out some of the elements that contributed to their success, such as extra work and effort, tutoring, parental support, previous educational backgrounds, and so on. Mehdi Riazi, who was an Iranian student that studied with me in Toronto, started looking at the what he called sociocognitive perspective on Iranian students of education in Toronto, and the strategies, the sort of broad strategies that they used to socialize themselves, again, at a graduate level, mostly doctoral students, into the field of that they were studying, and what becoming a member of that community meant for them, and the challenges that they faced, as well as, again, the successful steps they were taking. I should go back and say Mehdi Riazi went back to Iran and became an extremely influential person there, a dean at Shiraz University, and then he decided to skip out, and he's now at Melbourne University. He took over Jeff Brindley's position. Sorry, he's in Sydney at Macquarie University, was what I meant to say. Ling Shi was a student of mine as well, too, and she started out studying the effects of pre-writing group discussions on providing the knowledge and the motivation for writing in tasks, and then she's since gone on to do studies of textual borrowing, as she calls it, trying to understand the practices that relate to writing texts from sources in another language. Susan Parks and Mary Maguire, this was Susan Parks' PhD thesis in Montreal, an extremely interesting study I still find fascinating because it was so embedded in the natural context. And the natural context was a hospital in Montreal, studying how a few people learned to write nursing notes in that context and were coached by other people. We were talking a little bit this morning about scaffolding and so on. The scaffolding in this context is incredible, and no teachers involved. It's the other nurses, more experienced nurses, showing models to the person trying to figure out what was prescribed, expected, what should be done, and writing these notes about patients' conditions that would then be read by doctors and other health professionals in the hospital. And a fascinating study, and showing the ongoing peripheral participation and integration of the communication systems within the one kind of institution. I sometimes still have, when I teach a course on second language writing, I still have students read this article because I think it's quite fascinating. And it criticizes me so much at the beginning for having this experimental-based focus, but they hadn't realized that I'd shifted over with everybody else in the 90s to that. But it's true. But what a couple of people that are familiar with nursing notes in hospitals and that genre have pointed out to me is that isn't free hand writing anymore. It's all, you've got a little computer format and you punch in pieces of information. It's all become extremely standardized and therefore, I guess, learnable in a different way than it was in the 1990s. Then there's a whole new generation. This is over to the 2000s now, and students of these people and me and other people have assumed positions at major universities and other countries. Many have emigrated to Canada, like some of the people I've just cited, after they've done their doctoral studies in Canada. And they've established their own specialized little niches and areas that they've worked on. And for the most part, different than me, though my research, I'm bilingual English-French, as I mentioned before, and maybe know a little bit of other languages. Most of these people are bilingual with other languages or multilingual and have capitalized on that knowledge of other languages and the abilities. And here, Ling Shi is here, and her studies have very much looked at the insider perspective of Chinese Canadians or Chinese students studying at Canadian universities and the strategies they're using to write. And she's developed this whole, I think, interesting perspective on textual borrowing and the constraints on that and the expectations and the variation for it that are, I think, a much fuller and more useful explanation than just assuming that people are plagiarizing. And so conceiving textual borrowing as a learning process and becoming a member of an academic community and socializing themselves into that, but learning how to do so in the process. Guillaume Gentil, who did his PhD, he was originally from France, but did his PhD in McGill and then worked as a postdoc with me. And does anybody know what happened to him yesterday? He became the editor of the Journal of Second Language Writing suddenly. So he's really establishing his career. Rosa Manchon, who had done it for a number of years, decided to stop doing it after 6 or something like that. So Guillaume was just named yesterday as the as the new co-editor of it, and he does, I think, fascinating studies that integrate policy perspectives, focusing on French language speakers and writers, which is quite different than other people, and genre theory and how those interrelate. And he's professor at Carleton University in Ottawa now. Khaled Barkawi, some of you that work in assessment will know him, and he's a Tunisian who came to Canada, originally to the U.S., and did a fellowship there, and then did his PhD, and he's a professor at York University, and is really focused on writing assessment and studying that, and the role of rating processes, and holistic scoring, and those kinds of things that Vivian, you should know, and yeah, but he was, I forget when you were there. I think he arrived after you were visiting us in Toronto at some point. I should have your picture up here. And until I walked into the room earlier today, I'd forgotten that Vivian is here. I thought she was in Washington because I remember writing reference letters to both places. But I guess you get the better job is here, so, or the partner is, or what have you. Anyway. Ryoko Kubata, similar, and now she was in the U.S. for many years and is now in the University of British Columbia and focused on the, I guess, critical dimensions of contrastive rhetoric. To the person that was asking me about that, Ryoko's one of the people that has strongly criticized the idea, although she tried to explore it in her PhD thesis that she finished in the early 90s or so. And Bob Morgan is one of the few people that grew up in Canada rather than another part of the world, and he's focused on the kind of community second language writing context, not the academic ones, not the professional ones, but the community-based ESL and programs. You were talking about LINC here. Well, LINC to a Canadian means Language Instruction for Newcomers to Canada. It's the federally sponsored program for people learning English and immigrant settlement. So I almost cynically burst in there, but I didn't. But Bob Morgan worked in those programs, immigrant settlement programs, for a number of years, and developed, I guess, an interest. And his book is really about that context. And also internationally, there are graduates of the programs, as there would be from this program here, I'm sure, too, who've gone to other countries and established themselves internationally. Kyoko Baba's somebody who's focused on lexical proficiency in second language writing. I see the most recent issue of Language Learning has a study that she's followed up on and continued to pursue in Japan. In China, Lu Xinyang is somebody who's, again, studied in Canada and went on to China and is publishing quite prolifically about, her PhD thesis was about how students do group work in commerce classes and how they prepare their PowerPoint slides and writing about that. And then some of the subsequent studies have been about Chinese teachers' professional development and how they've, through the successive generations, have modified their practice in relation to different cultural influences in the society and educational influences. And in the U.S., Mark James stands out as one of the people that had studied in Toronto and is now in Arizona, and does very interesting studies of transfer. What transfers from an English language or writing program into writing skills in other areas like engineering or subsequent academic studies or work, and I think an important area. So that's the history as I see it. Whether you're interested or not, you got it, and that's it. And I wanted to say a little bit about what the current trends are, and because I think these may be more interesting and more appealing to those of you who don't necessarily specialize in second language writing, or if you do. These are the hot topics that I see people investigating in their PhD theses related to second language writing, and in some cases other areas. And one is my now retired colleague Meryl Swain's idea of languaging, of verbalizing as a process, either speaking or writing, to consolidate one's knowledge about a language, originally formulated to challenge Stephen Krassen's idea of comprehensible input, and arguing that the output, the production of spoken language, and then in more recent years, people have been pursuing the written language as well, too. A lot of the studies are about spoken language, but Wataru Suzuki is somebody whose thesis and then subsequent article elaborated this, how writing about in using the language allows people to reflect on their own texts, to question and analyze their knowledge of the language, extend their linguistic resources, and produce texts that are perhaps better. And his studies involved revision to elaborate that context. So languaging is one of the topics that I see so many people studying, and that may be because of Meryl Swain's influence and some of the other former students of hers and the projects that she's had. The longitudinal studies of teaching and learning in the zone of proximal development. The study I was talking about this morning in this morning's lecture, I guess, is an example of that. Susan Park's study, and this is set similarly in a high school student context in Quebec City, tracing a long-term project in which the students wrote about the history of theater and enacted different things, similarly has a sociocultural Vygotsky analysis and a longitudinal perspective on writing development. And so seeing how people develop rather than just looking at snapshots of their behavior, I think, is very much a trend. And there are lots of studies taking up the longitudinal perspective and trying to understand what constitutes a zone of proximal development, how it changes, how variable it is, and try to explain what it is and how it materializes and shifts and so on. Rahat Naqvi's research is mostly about reading with young kids in culturally diverse contexts, setting up situations where the students bring books from their home language or ethnic language and perhaps parents or other people to read, and they all read to the other students in the class and they share their texts. And with remarkable success and interest. Jim Cummins and some of his students and Margaret Early have focused more on the writing, where the students write texts in the other languages in these culturally diverse contexts. And what the benefits they're showing, their research is showing, it may seem odd to think about doing this, but the kind of schools that they're working in are so culturally diverse that everybody's from a different background, is that the real benefit is empowering the students to make evident and develop interests in their language and showing analyzing how the similarities exist across, no matter what the difference in the scripts or the topics or the actual language are, how similar what similarities there are in the across languages in reading and in writing, but also expressing oneself. And I think many of these projects also involve talk in English, if that's the dominant language in the school and so on, and sharing the value and bringing in parents, grandparents, and other people to read these things sets up a community liaison and so on. But this core idea is to valorize the identity of the students and to, as Jim Cummins' research over the last 10 years or so has showed that much of the problems with minority background students relates to the fact that their languages are devalorized, denigrated, and not put in the foreground. And this is a way of countering that, and it seems to mostly be done with younger students, elementary schools, and in situations where there are culturally diverse populations, rather than what seems to happen in the U.S. And not much in Canada, the two-way bilingual programs. That we have English-French bilingual programs, and have had for a long time, but the two-way bilingual programs haven't really taken off mainly because of cultural diversity in Canada. There are just not very many situations where there are very distinct populations that all go to the two language groups that go to the same school, unless they happen to be English and French, and that's still geographically restricted as well. Research syntheses, systematic research syntheses, ranging from the very precisely organized meta-analyses to more narrative or analytic reviews on particular topics are an area. I just cite something that a study preliminary to the research I talked about earlier today. We did a meta-analysis of studies of tutoring adolescents in literacy and found, as they usually do in meta-analyses, found with a library search about 100 articles written on that, but then when we reviewed them and looked at how well the research was done and whether they had clear-cut findings or not, reduced that down to, I forget, about 17 or something like that, and then analyzed the effects and found there were consistent effects for tutoring, but the biggest effects were in second languages rather than first languages, and in cross-age tutoring rather than any other form. The really distinct effects were older students tutoring younger students, with a couple of grades difference in between that. And so finding these things out of a burgeoning or diffuse research area is another. Chung-Gil Yoon's another PhD student who wrote, preliminary to his PhD thesis, a review of uses of concordances in writing classrooms, for example. The studies that I've found particularly fascinating and are really taking off now are design-based research. Is that a familiar concept to people here? For some people, it's been around education for a couple of decades or so, but it's just starting to pick up in language education and applied linguistics. Mary Schleppergrill at University of Michigan in a recent issue of Language Learning has one in a school setting about reading and systemic functional linguistics about it. And I was asked at the Language Testing Research Colloquium to be a discussant for a set of papers. Eunice Jang is a colleague, Korean background colleague at OISE in Toronto, and Carol Chappell, Matt Poner, and Charles Alderson had all presented studies that they had conceptualized as being studies of diagnostic language assessment. And I was asked to be the respondent to that. And I read through them, and yeah, they're all about diagnostic assessment, but they're all design-based studies. Design-based studies being where the researchers, following a metaphor of developing computer systems or new systems, try out something in a class, look for the affordances, what works well and what doesn't work well, and then go through a series of cycles systematically to try it out once for a few months or so, find out what works well, what doesn't, and then try it out again in real classroom contexts or real educational settings with real learners and students and teachers and the real context instead of the experimental lab kind of conditions, and gradually and progressively refine those studies so that they get a better handle on all of the complex factors that are involved. And Chung-Gil Yoon's actual PhD thesis, tutoring students on web-based concordancing systems who were graduate students in different fields of study, is, I think, another example of a design-based research. And I see that as one of the major research thrusts for the future in the area of applied linguistics. I got a feeling this is, oh no, I've got another one. The teachers' learning communities. Teachers' learning community, that is for professional developments, teachers coming together, recognizing that their graduate degrees or their teacher certification didn't provide them with the knowledge that they needed to know and that they need to continue learning, and that they face common problems and issues, coming together to meet once a week or every so often, focus on common issues. And this study of Chris Manson et al. Is about French teachers in elementary schools in New Brunswick. Is, I think, a very exemplary piece documenting that. And one of my colleagues, Rob Simon in Toronto, has been doing that with teachers of English in culturally diverse contexts. So I think that's the other big area. I see people putting in research proposals for research funding and doing PhD theses in and around, and of great value to education. And then this gets to the point where, yes, thank you again, Lanchin. I said this morning that I systematically leave off the thank you that's supposed to be the end of the genre for PowerPoint presentations, and I thank you for inserting the thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.